Next we have James Parrott, Deputy Director and Chief Economist, Fiscal Policy Institute, and Paul Son, General Counsel and Program Director, National Employment Law Project. Gentlemen, welcome.
Good afternoon.
Thank you for your patience. Happy New Year. Paul, good to see you again.
Great. Likewise, Senator. Thank you.
Thanks for your patience. Good afternoon, Senators. There's no point in sticking to my testimony. Hopefully you have a copy of that.
We sure do.
I would much rather talk about some of the interesting things that you've been talking about and address some of that. So I do want to cover a couple of things that I did speak to in my prepared remarks, and then I want to address some of the questions that have come up. So I do have some numbers in the prepared testimony on the erosion in household income levels and wage levels in recent years. There's clearly been a stagnation taking place over, since the recession began and going back further than that. That same sort of stagnation has not characterized the path of business profits in New York State. Early last month, we put out a little data brief that, using U.S. Commerce Department data, noted that business profits per worker in New York have increased since 2001 almost twice as fast as the level of compensation per worker. And that's much, and the compensation increase per worker includes highly paid executives. So if you look at the median wage worker, the gap between the nominal growth in their wages and profits is even greater. So we should keep that in mind. We also have a graph in there on the sky-high child poverty rate in New York State. And, we're here talking about raising the minimum wage because a lot of these children living in poverty have a working parent who just doesn't earn enough to raise a family above even the admittedly very low federal poverty level. Earlier this week, the Economic Policy Institute, a nationally prominent economic policy research group, probably the most prominent that's worked for the last couple of decades on the minimum wage issue, prepared for New York a detailed analysis of the prospective worker impact of raising over a phased-in period the minimum wage in New York State to $15. So it's worth reciting some of the highlights of that report so that we have a good baseline understanding of what sort of the best analysis and thinking in terms of who's affected by this. So 3,200,000 New York workers are estimated to be affected by this. This is 37% of the state's wage and salary workforce. The analysis separated New York City from the rest of the state as the wage board, the fast food wage board minimum wage increase did. And our thinking is that that's what the governor will incorporate it into his proposal. So in New York City, 1,400,000 workers would be affected, 35% of the workforce. Outside of the city, 1.7 million workers, 38% of the workforce. Three-fourths of these workers are 25 and older, so we're not mainly talking about teenagers here anymore. That hasn't been the case for a long time, and yet a lot of the debate is still sort of stuck in a rut of 20 years ago, talking about how this mainly affects teenage workers. That's not the case.
Let me ask you, just on that point, does that include restaurant workers, tip workers as well in that statistic?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah, we've included all of the wage and salary workers in that. 2/3 of these workers work full-time, and more than half have some college experience, either a 4-year college degree, 2-year college degree, or at least have attended college. A third have children, and 45% of female single parents would benefit from this increase. So, this increase, while it's not limited to affecting workers from low-income families, it really does a very effective job of helping the incomes of workers in low-income families, and it benefits a lot of single-parent families. Roughly half of the workers affected statewide are persons of color, And more than half of all Latino workers in the state, more than half, would benefit from this increase. And 40% of African-American workers in the state would benefit from this. Low-income households disproportionately benefit. More than a third of the affected workers are from families either in poverty or near poverty. And over 3/4 of all workers in or near poverty would get a raise from this. Three sectors sort of stand out in terms of the number of workers affected. And we've talked about two of these. I want to focus on a third one. So retail obviously is the largest sector affected by this. Restaurant sector, not surprisingly, is the second largest. The sector that comes right behind the restaurant sector, though, is this sort of a broad look at the human services sector, everything from home health care workers to nursing home, residential care workers, workers providing services to the developmentally disabled, social assistance workers, child care workers, and so on. So this about 420,000 human service workers taking this broad approach would benefit from a $15 minimum wage. This is almost half of all workers in this sector. Now, this sector is unique in that most employers are nonprofit employers in this sector. Most are working under government contracts, many under state government contracts, or they provide services that are reimbursed under Medicaid, and the state, sets the Medicaid reimbursement rate. So the state is in a position to adjust the funding streams that go to these nonprofits to enable these organizations to pay higher wages. And we would strongly urge that the state look carefully at doing that. We think that it's fiscally smart to do that. And if, in effect, you don't have a choice either, because you can't leave these workers out, raise the wages for all other workers in the state, and not provide that increase to these workers who when you think about, this workforce is 80% female and disproportionately women of color. Their wages are low because the kind of services they provide the kind of occupations they have typically been considered female dominated and have been underpaid and undervalued for that reason. So, in terms of gender pay equity and racial pay equity, the state has to step up to the plate and do something about this workforce. We've tried to estimate the cost of doing this for a subset of this workforce. We haven't looked at the home health care side because we know that the 1199 folks are doing that. We haven't looked at the other part of Medicaid reimbursable services like developmental disabilities. I think you'll hear from other witnesses on that point today. They've done their own estimates. We've looked at the sort of the narrow look at the human services sector, which is social assistance and child care workers funded under state government contracts. Looking at the state comptroller's website, it looks like there are about $1.5 billion in contracts on an annual basis. And so looking at the number of workers who are employed under those contracts and trying to estimate what a phased-in increase would be, our best sense at this point is that it would cost $60 to $75 million in the first year to cover the two increases if the first increase took place April 1st and the second increase took place December 31st, 2016. And that when it's fully phased in, it would cost $250 to $300 million a year. And this would provide not only funding increases to raise all workers to 15, but also it would provide for some spillover increase because you have a lot of social workers, for example, who might have a master's of social work degree. They're making more than 15, but their work has also been historically undervalued. So you want to provide some wage adjustment to those workers, so we tried to factor that in. Let me say a little bit more about child care workers. It was interesting that E.J. McMahon talks so much about child care workers. I'm glad to know that he's concerned about the abysmally low wages in the sector. So, we think there are things that the state can do. So two things come to mind in addition to sort of covering in human service contracts that go to child care services, increased funding. So A lot of low-income workers depend upon child care subsidies. If you're going to raise the wages of the workers providing those child care services, you're going to have to adjust the amount of the subsidies. For those moderate income families who are making a little bit above the eligibility level for child care subsidies, the state could target an increase in the child and dependent care tax credit so that those families would be able to reduce their net costs that they're having to pay, because they're going to have to pay higher rates, higher fees in order to accommodate the increased wages that child care workers need to receive. Now, to offset these additional costs on the part of government, we need to think about the fiscal dividend that goes along with this increase in the minimum wage. The Urban Institute did a study earlier in early 2015 looking at modeling different approaches to reducing poverty in New York City. And what they found was, one of the policies they modeled was an increase to $15. If you look at that report and analyze what they're saying, they're basically saying that there's a 43% fiscal dividend that is for every aggregate dollar of increase in minimum wages in the total amount paid out. Government at all levels, not just the state or New York City, but all levels of government, and a lot of this admittedly is at the federal level, would benefit by 43 cents, both in terms of savings in reduced cost of public assistance and the increased tax payments that these low-wage workers would be paying. So that they're going to pay more in income taxes, they're going to pay more in sales taxes as their consumer spending goes up. So in part, the state would be seeing some of this fiscal dividend that could be used to help offset some of the higher costs that we're talking about. So let me quickly address a couple of things that have come up earlier. On your exercise of looking at going on the Labor Department website and adjusting the minimum wage so that if you adjust it for inflation, it would be $11.50 an hour, something like that. What that calculator doesn't factor in is the fact that there's been significant growth in productivity in the economy over time, so that if you adjusted the 1970 minimum wage, that's when it reached a peak in terms of the CPI level for New York State, if you adjusted it for productivity growth, the minimum wage today would be $18, over $18, and by 2021 it would be $21 an hour. So that's
no argument. We weren't discussing the productivity, though. We were discussing solely the issue of tagging it to CPI.
And what that calculation also doesn't factor in is the higher cost of living. So if you adjusted the New York's 1970 minimum wage for the higher cost of living in New York State overall and for the CPI, you would get a minimum wage of $15 in 2015, actually. It would be a little higher going forward. The second thing I want to talk about is how would businesses accommodate this $15 billion increase in wages, which coincidentally the EPI analysis of the effect of looking at the worker impact also says that this would result in an aggregate increase in wages of $15 billion. Maybe that's where the governor got his figure from, I'm not sure. What we haven't really focused on a lot is the fact that, of course, this is phased in over time, and that many businesses can adapt by, very slight changes in prices. Paul Son's going to talk a little bit more about this Los Angeles study that looked at how businesses would accommodate that, and so very modest price increases, and the Cornell professor very appropriately pointed out that this is probably a fortuitous macroeconomic period to be talking about doing something like this, because inflation is very low, unemployment's come down, and so on. And because inflation is very low, actually, the Federal Reserve would like to see inflation a little bit higher than what it is right now. They would consider that a good macroeconomic result if it's a little bit higher than it is. So there's clearly some room there for businesses. And again, if this is done across the board in New York State, then no individual business is at a competitive disadvantage by raising their prices. So part of the
companies in New York.
Pardon?
with respect to other businesses
Well, right,
in New York.
but most of the workers in low-wage sectors are serving a local market, so a lot of them are service-oriented. Retailing basically is local market-oriented and so on. So they're not competing, on a global basis necessarily. A lot of their competitors are within New York, but we're not talking about huge price increases. We're talking about slight price increases on the order of 1% to 3% a year. So we should keep that in mind. I should probably stop at that point.
Entirely up to you. You're good?
Yep.
Mr. Sun.
Very good.
Mr. Parrott, thank you.
Sure.
Great. Thank you, Senators. Is that on? Great. Well, you have my written testimony as well. I'll just hit some of the points that have come up in the conversation. One thing I think that's really significant to communicate is that the significant and growing business community support for the governor's proposal, and this hearing was called on with not lots of advance notice, and so we were appreciated hearing the nuanced position of the Retail Council, but there actually, in addition to them, there is a growing list of both trade associations and individual businesses that are backing the governor's proposal as proposed with the 5-year phase-in. I believe written testimony from 8 of them have been submitted for this hearing from businesses and trade associations across the state, including Rochester's New Shelves Publishing, the owner Amy Collins from Ithaca, retail store owner Jan Rhodes of Silk Oak Retail, also the Ben & Jerry's board chair from Ithaca, two Long Island businesses and one trade association, the Long Island African American Chamber of Commerce, Spectronics Corporation in Westbury, Terranut in West Babylon, and a Hudson Valley business.
Mr. Son, if we have received them, they'll be part of the record.
Great.
Sure.
We look for.
And I'll make sure that everybody on the committee receives a copy of it.
Terrific, thank you. And we'd welcome, for future hearings, the opportunity to have some of the trade associations and individual businesses be able to speak in person if possible. So.
I appreciate your request on their behalf. Thank you, Mr. Son.
Thank you. Also, I think in my written testimony, there's been increasing media coverage of responses by employers in low-wage sectors such as restaurants and retail to the $15 minimum wage. And there are, while the Business Council and the Empire Center have opposed, you can count on them to oppose any proposal to increase the minimum wage, large or small. It's striking that there are more business voices saying this is manageable if phased in. And I kind of direct you to my written testimony, section 2. There's a Rochester area business owner, also happens to teach at the University of Rochester Business School, noted Harlem restaurateur, and the CEO of Popeyes have all said that there's really been too much of a big deal made about the $15, that if phased in properly, it really is manageable for businesses to adjust. On the point of where the $15 figure came from, it's it, as I think has been discussed, on one level it came from workers themselves. This was sort of their demand, but in terms of cost of living, it really, that the economic case for why workers need 15 everywhere really starts with living costs. And the Economic Policy Institute report has stats on that. We also have a similar report coming out next week that shows even in the lowest cost parts of the state, in Rochester, Buffalo, Syracuse, the North Country, a single worker needs, by 2021, will need over $31,000 a year, which translates to $15 an hour, just to cover a basic budget, to rent an apartment, to cover housing, food, and living costs. It's true there are varying economies and living costs in the state, but 15 is really the floor, and then those costs go up downstate on Long Island and Westchester and New York City, where arguably an individual worker actually needs more than $15. But so the governor's proposal is really pegged to what workers reasonably need, a single worker, in the least expensive parts of the state.
To that end, what's the model that you're looking at? Are you considering this as a parent two-income household with two children? What is the model that you are basing that statement on? Is it a single parent with two kids? Is it two parents or two workers working at minimum wage with a, how do we draw that?
No, good question. I'm sorry I wasn't clear. That's the single worker with no dependent, but basic budget using the family budget calculator. The numbers just go up from there. Sure. If you have single workers or a pair of low-wage workers supporting children. So it's 15 is the baseline that a single worker in the least expensive parts of the state will need by 2021 to cover the basics. Then workers with dependents upstate and even single workers downstate would need arguably more. But 15 is obviously a huge advance, would be a very significant increase in the minimum wage for everyone. And so again, we have a report sort of breaking down by the family type and region of the state that will be coming out in the next week or two, detailing that. I guess on generally the economic literature on the minimum wage, I think Professor Barrington really, her characterization of it, I think it is exactly right, that the bulk of the credible research on minimum wage increases in the United States over the past 20 years shows very, very small adverse effects on wages, and in our written testimony, there are these meta-studies that present this visually through funnel graphs, and you can see that the bulk of the studies are clustered around a finding of very, very small adverse effects on jobs. And I think instinctively you all know that. You voted for a series of modest minimum wage increases in the past few years. I think the legislature, Republicans and Democrats, concluded that they were unlikely to significantly hurt the state's economy, and the business press and the media have confirmed that conclusion, that there's been no evidence that the past increases you approved have hurt the state's economy. The studies that my friend EJ has cited are really, and that he has that modeling exercise with the American Action Forum, they are really all outliers that don't represent the bulk of the research. The written testimony explains he used two individual, he has three different models. One of them is the Mir and West study, which has been discredited by other economists. It claims that small minimum wage increases result in big job losses in industries that don't even have many low-wage workers. It's really, truly an outlier. Same with the Clemens and Withers study he mentioned. He actually mentioned another study in the Cornell ILR review from 2012 by a guy named Joseph Sabia, that he said that purported to find that the $6.75 minimum wage increase that New York phased in from 2004 to 2006, that it killed a lot of jobs in the state. I think EJ maybe hasn't caught up in his back issues of the ILR review, or maybe his subscription has lapsed. But if you look in last September,
we don't need to go there. we don't need to go there. But
with respect, there's a study that reruns those numbers. The Sabia study used just a subset of the available federal government data set. The latest Cornell ILR study reruns the numbers and shows that those surprising adverse effects from past minimum wage increases in New York disappear. So the bulk of the research shows that recent minimum wage increases studied have had very small adverse effects on jobs. But that brings you to the question of these $15 proposals, which are on a larger scale than the United States has experience with. And so the state-of-the-art research modeling that impact is what University of California economists did under contract for the city of Los Angeles, and which was published there. And I think we've summarized it in our materials, but it really actually is it's a very sophisticated model that many economists have helped develop and weigh in on. But it really identifies two major impacts that a big minimum wage increase has on employers and labor markets. The first is a large impact on labor costs, and so in the literature suggests that's absorbed generally through three channels. There's some actually efficiency savings as workers stay on the job longer. That may amount for offset up to a quarter of the cost. There's some trimmed profit margins, but a big chunk of it comes out of prices. Probably half or more. There are price adjustments. So the first big effect that the LA modeling shows is when you raise the minimum wage to 15, employers' labor costs will go up. They'll adjust prices. That's sort of a negative on business because then consumers can afford to buy less. So that's a negative on business sales. That is one effect. However, then the second part of the modeling identifies the second big effect that you get from a $15 minimum wage increase, which is a large expansion of employee wages and consumer spending power, which in turn creates new sales at businesses where workers spend their wages. And the LA modeling shows that those two effects are on roughly comparable orders of magnitude, that they largely offset each other, and they predicted a very small net job loss that will be experienced in LA over the 5-year phase-in period. So, and I think that's sort of instructive of the way New York, and there should be similar modeling should be done for New York for the governor's proposal to take a close look at its likely impact. But I think you would likely find that these two effects largely offset each other. There may be some small adverse impact on jobs, which largely taking the form of slightly slowed job growth. But the benefits for workers are really, as Professor Barrington said, really historic and far-reaching. I mean, the impact numbers: more than 3 million New Yorkers getting a raise on an average of $4,800 a year. These are for workers making around, say, $20,000. That really is the first public policy step that the legislature has been asked to take in the last decades that would really rebalance the kind of wage growth patterns in the state and restore prosperity and a shot at a middle class existence for more than 3 million New Yorkers. On just other last points.
The minimum wage increase that we voted on a couple of years ago doesn't count, right?
No, it's very significant, really, an important step forward. One issue that has not been addressed, I think, very much to date is the question of how the legislature will approach tipped workers with this proposal, which is a very significant issue. The state has made real strides. It has had a very low tipped wage historically for a long time. Last year, Albany, through the governor and the Labor Department, raised the tipped wage to $7.50, which raises it that's 83% of our new $9 minimum wage. So they went a good distance of the way towards bringing it up to the full minimum wage level. So we would urge that the legislature and the governor to really to continue that trend and gradually, very incrementally over time, slowly phase out the tipped sub-minimum wage as part of the package that you hammer out around the full minimum wage. And the reasons for that, I think there are several. The first is many of the tipped industries are really notorious sweatshop industries where workers are barely getting by. These are nail salons that have been the subject of so much media coverage, car washes, pizza delivery people, the personal assistance workers at the airports, and they surely should be getting the full minimum wage and any tips on top of that. The second reason is it's widely recognized by enforcement officials that the tipped wage, the complicated tipped wage system where employers are supposed to track tips and net up workers if their total compensation doesn't meet the minimum wage, is very difficult to enforce, and it's the single aspect of the wage and hour laws that accounts for the largest number of violations in the restaurant industry. And it's phasing it out eliminates this serious enforcement problem. 3, it's a huge working women's issue. Tipped workers are overwhelmingly women, and it's one of those factors contributing to to the fact that the tipped workers have more than double the poverty rate of New York's workforce as a whole. 4th, there's no serious case that it's economically necessary, and we know that because there are 8 states that have eliminated the tipped minimum wage, and many of them they include Minnesota, California, Nevada, Washington, Oregon, Alaska, a variety of states. Many of them have top growth restaurant markets there, and in fact these high minimum wage cities, Los Angeles, San Francisco, Seattle, are all in states where there's no lower tip minimum wage. So and the restaurant industry pays the full tip minimum wage, and then the full minimum wage and tips on top of that, and it's booming in those cities. I think the counter argument, the concern that's always been raised has been focused on been the argument that tipped workers actually earn significant amounts in tips and really don't need a higher based wage. And that is true for a small segment of the restaurant industry, especially in Manhattan at higher end restaurants. But first, that's not representative of tipped workers in the state. The median wage for tipped workers, even after counting tips, this was from 2 years ago, was about $9 and I think it was 30 cents or so. So just more than the minimum wage, but still very, very low. So it's and then the other so it's, you know, tipped workers are you know, really are not are low wage workers who really deserve a raise. And then on the issue of the high-end restaurants, in fact, you know, in the past, many of them said that we can't get rid of tipping. Consumers really, you know, want the tipping system, and it's really distorting our pay scales, where the wait staff end up being very, very highly compensated. Well, we're now seeing this trend where actually many of those high-end restaurants are starting to eliminate tipping. There's a growing number. Danny Meyer has eliminated it. Joe's Crab Shack, the first national chain to do it. So it shows that actually for the high-end restaurants, if you know, there's an alternative solution. And in fact, if restaurants are getting rid of tipping, though, it's really all the more important to have a very high base minimum wage, like, you know, the governor's proposed $15 minimum wage. And the last point, maybe the earned income tax credit that there's, you know, been discussion about. It is, you know, an excellent policy, and New York's earned income tax credit really should be expanded significantly. But that is not a substitute for raising the minimum wage. They go hand in hand. And if you actually were serious and wanted to deliver a comparable increase through an expansion of the earned income tax credit, you would have to almost triple the size of New York's earned income tax credit. You would also have to expand it more generously to single workers. It would surely cost several billions of dollars. And so you know, the only reason earned income tax credit expansions in the past have been less expensive is because they've been very small. So it's not a substitute, but it could really a strong earned income tax credit together with a strong minimum wage go hand in hand in being able to lift workers up to a decent level.